The US government does not care if Americans die. It is a murder regime in that way. It is an actively pro-death government. So we shouldn't be surprised when that casts out to the global scale also.
Welcome to Rethinking Humanitarianism, a show that explores the future of aid in a world of rising crises. I'm your host, Tammam Aloudat, CEO of The New Humanitarian. It is not an exaggeration to say that we are currently experiencing a major shift when it comes to the United Nations and humanitarianism. Right now, the big focus has been on the US aid freeze and funding cuts. The US has of course been the biggest contributor to foreign aid in the past, and it is true that there are huge and deadly impacts that have been felt in terms of humanitarianism because of this. For example, a study by The Lancet last month stated that the closure of USAID could contribute to 14 million deaths in the next 5 years. However, I think to just talk about money is to miss the point. And I would like to argue that we aren't necessarily in a crisis of funding, but more of a crisis of how liberalism is practiced. To help us shed some light on this topic, we are joined by Mark Goldberg and Anjali Dayal, hosts of the podcast To Save Us From Hell, a show that dives deep into all things UN. Mark Goldberg is also the creator of UNDispatch and the host of the long-standing international affairs podcast, Global Dispatches. Anjali Dayal is an assistant professor of international politics at Fordham University and the author of the book, Incredible Commitments: How UN Peacekeeping Failures Shape Peace Processes. If you have any questions or comments, stick around for the credits to learn about how to reach us here at Rethinking Humanitarianism. Mark, Anjali, thank you very much for being on Rethinking Humanitarianism.
Thank you so much, Tammam, for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, Mark, before we talk about the success or failure of liberalism in our days, we need to talk about what liberalism is, because it seems to be one of those terms that everybody says and means something different. And in the US, for example, liberal is a word for leftist or for non-MAGA these days. Or in international order, the liberal order has conditions. Can you help us navigate that?
You know, to me at least, liberalism, as we would define it in the international world order, is premised on the idea that there is a need for solidarity, global solidarity, and that we are all bound together in a singular project to make the world a slightly better place, and each individual in each country, and each country as a government, has their own unique responsibilities to bring to that project. And in the context of humanitarianism, that would imply, at least to me, that wealthier countries are obligated and have a responsibility to support the welfare and development of people, not only in their own country, but to the extent possible around the world, in order to nudge the world into a more progressive direction. I mean, the premise of liberalism is that the world can become a more interconnected, a more productive place when we all work together.
And this is, to my mind, the benevolent definition of liberalism, because it also includes the other side of the coin, not only the political, the common destiny sort of argument, but also the free market and the movement of goods and services and all that, which also seems to be not holding up. I mean, as much as I loathe talking about the guy, but the prediction of Francis Fukuyama in the early 90s, who talked about the end of history and the absolute triumph of liberal democracy, seems to be coming to an end these days. because part of liberalism also, and part of that singular global project, is global institutions, and those include the United Nations primarily, the holders of that project. Anjali, how does those two interact? Where are we with the UN as a sort of set of liberal institutions?
I would define liberalism slightly differently in this context, right? I would say if we think about the origins of the UN system and of all of the global institutions that we have today that emerged from the middle of the 20th century, they are liberal in the sense that they were explicitly built as contra fascist institutions, right? But also anchored in the particular vision of liberalism as the rights of the individual, the consent of the governed, individual rights to private property, political equality, and equality before the law. Now, that is a package of ideas that is liberal in nature, but that runs at cross purposes in meaningful ways, right? So the sort of liberal economic argument can undercut the idea that all people should be able to flourish in equality, especially in the absence of a particular vision of government regulation and intervention. And the way those two things have decoupled, I think, shows us something about the nature of humanitarian aid, the economic argument from the individual rights argument. But at its foundation, the UN system and the other Bretton Woods institutions, they are liberal insofar as they privilege the rights of the individual over the rights of the group, or other kinds of measures of social order. And in that sense, the package of ideas that defines these institutions is that people are sovereign over themselves. And that has an echo at the sort of level of the individual person, right? The individual person should be free to certainly choose their government, right? But free from the government's right to assign arbitrary death or punishment or torture, right? At the level of the individual nation, to be self-determined, to be able to enter into the society of states as a political entity that determines its own fate. And at the level of the international system, in that the sovereign equality of all states is echoed in a particular kind of ideology of political and economic interaction.
You've put it, Anjali, as pretty much the individual freedom, the individual liberty of persons to choose their life, to choose government. So democracy and individual freedoms.
Right.
Do those go hand in hand? Are they functioning together well? Because there has been arguments that, the two aren't entirely compatible. And that has affected the way, for example, some of the institutions that function with our governments, or Bretton Woods institutions, that is the IMF and the World Bank, have dealt with people globally, often discarding both their democratic right and individual freedoms in the name of the same system that they are saying that they're defending or enforcing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where we see the sort of key fracture line between the individual rights argument that applies to sort of civil and human rights, right? And the individual economic liberal argument. In order to sustain a model of economic liberalization, the sort of reducing of barriers, the integration of economies at various points in developments into a global economy, you do end up with institutions that are not democratically responsive in the same way to individual countries. And you particularly end up with systems that are deeply unfair and exploitive of poorer countries, right? That's the classic sort of Marxist critique of these institutions. It's also the classic Global South critique of these institutions. It's that the argument about political freedom actually occludes a deeply repressive, unequal, and hierarchical economic system.
I've worked in humanitarianism all my life, and most of the time was in projects on the ground. And what we're tempted to see is crises as bubbles in themselves. Conflicts have their own local causes. But this is not the basic idea of the UN. The UN assumes that there is a global role and a global interaction that either causes crisis to be easier to happen, conflicts and others. And I say crisis intentionally to include stuff like the effects of the climate catastrophe, or try to limit them. And now we're going through this stage where everybody's freaking out about the budget cuts for the UN. I mean, I live in Geneva, and Geneva is a UN town, and everybody's talking about who's going to be fired. And so the symptom is the lack of resources for the UN, but the disease is deeper than that. There is a problem fundamentally of incompatibility between the principles it claims, the title of your podcast, to save us from hell, and what it was able to do or to stand for, particularly those inequalities between different countries. I mean, how do you see the UN's role between the political role, the humanitarian role, the military, and the developmental ones? And what is going right and wrong in your view under the circumstances?
So, just kind of big picture, having covered the UN for about 20 years now, and having studied the history of the UN as well, it always is and operates as a function of the geopolitical circumstances in which it operates, right? So there have been times over the years since the advent of the UN where it has served, its purpose as intended. And there are times when it has fallen short. Each instance is, I think, a consequence of, the broader political forces in which it operates at that time. You look at the UN today, and it's certainly the case that the UN is unable to perform its role as an entity that prevents or ends conflicts, most conflicts, I'd say. You look at the long war in Syria, which thankfully has come to a close, and the UN had almost no role to play in ending that role. You look at Ukraine, the UN has no role to play in ending that war. You look at Gaza, the UN has no role to play in ending that war. And in each case, that's a function of geopolitics. On the other hand, you look at other aspects of the UN, and here I'd principally say the UN's humanitarian agencies. The UN, is still, despite these cuts that have so eviscerated the humanitarian functions of the UN today. I mean, a year ago, these cuts weren't in place, and the UN, I think, was doing a lot to help at the margins manage the fallout of some of these conflicts that the UN was unable to prevent or stop. So when I talk to more general public audiences, I say there's the UN that talks and there's the UN that acts. And, the UN that talks is often the UN that we assume is a failure because it's not preventing many of these conflicts around the world. But the UN that acts is helping, sometimes profoundly, sometimes at the margins, but, I think helping nonetheless. And then there's the role as the UN as just a convener. The UN is a unique institution for the fact that it contains all governments around the world, plus robust participation from civil society. And as a platform to bring people together and institutions and governments together around issues, it still, I think, serves a useful function.
I mean, that's a good frame. And the UN that talks, that acts, and that convenes are distinct functions. And because I have a reputation of being an eternal pessimist, I have to use it now. The UN that talks, if it ever talked effectively, hasn't in a decade managed to talk through the Security Council or actually effectively pass anything. The UN that acts is being eviscerated and cut down. And here my concern again, as a practitioner, the Lancet, which is a medical journal, has published an article estimating the mortality of the cuts only of the US international aid. That includes programs on like PEPFAR, which provided treatment for HIV globally, malaria, mother and child health, to reach over 14 million deaths in the next 5 years. And that would be manifold, unless, we actually go to hell, manifold the conflict average mortality over those 5 years. And yet the UN that acts or talks hasn't mentioned much about that. We've heard a lot in the news about, USAID staff that will lose their jobs, UN staff that will lose their jobs. There is an estimate of several tens of thousands of people who have contracted and died of HIV in the past few months. My question is, when is the UN a force for good that doesn't function well? And when is it a fig leaf that covers for a massive failure by not speaking out? Someone who, like Trump administration, who causes the death by commission or omission of hundreds of thousands of or millions of people, haven't been confronted with it in any official format. Is the UN just sitting there and trying to be the nice guy who doesn't lose more money, or is it not their purview to start with?
I think we'd have to ask who the UN is. And we have to disaggregate the UN across multiple different functions of its work. Mark talked about the UN that acts and the UN that does. The UN is a creature of its member states, right? It's an intergovernmental organization. And the UN, therefore, does not do what its member states do not want it to do. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily a fig leaf, right? It's a political reality that if we trace out the different bodies in the different parts of the UN, right? The UN that does, we largely understand to be a body of agencies that's funded and staffed by member states at the highest levels, right? And that is populated by an international civil service at the more operational levels. The UN that talks is what sets the budget and priorities and the framework for action. Now, in between that, we have the Secretariat, right? And in theory, a lot depends on who leads the Secretariat, because the sort of extremes of the Secretariat's scope for action are set by the member states. And between those extremes, there's a lot of capacity for creative action on the part of the Secretary General, but also on the part of the International Civil Service. And so one thing that we could say, for instance, is that there have been times when we would say, let's take the Syrian example, for instance. We know the reason that we don't see concerted action on Syria through the Security Council is because of the role of Russia, the sort of singular role of Russia in vetoing. So since 2011, according to Security Council report, Russia has cast 19 vetoes, 14 of which were on Syria as of 2024. In the same period, 8 of the 9 Chinese vetoes during this period were on Syria. 1 was on Venezuela. And so what we see is like active, explicit obstruction of multilateral efforts that are really popular along other fronts, along other countries, along other constituencies, along the Secretariat. Now, when we think about what the UN is in a larger sense, there was a big push among international legal scholars, for instance, for the Secretary General to start undertaking cross-border aid without waiting for the Syrian government's permission, without waiting for the Security Council's permission, because in theory, that should be permissible under international law. What it requires is a kind of political boldness or a kind of political determination that that's within the scope of the Secretary General's legal action. Now, either because of his personal reluctance to do so, or because he thought he might need to bank political capital with either the Syrian government or the Russian government, that's not a route that the Secretary General chose to go down. Instead, what we see is a series of negotiations about cross-line, cross-border aid led by the non-permanent members of the Security Council in a sort of passing the baton kind of way to ensure that first 5, then all the way down to 1 crossing is open for aid to flow into northwest Syria. That is a deeply imperfect solution, obviously, right? And when we think about whether the UN is harming or helping in that situation, it depends on what we think the baseline is, the counterfactual is. Is the counterfactual that no aid was going to get into Syria absent the work, for example, of the non-permanent members? Or is the counterfactual that with a more bold Secretary General, everything would have fallen down in the correct way and a lot of aid could have flown into northwest Syria? I don't actually know the answer to that question because it requires a ton, I think, of careful study. But the arguments, I think, are all importantly valid when we think about the kinds of political trade-offs and calculations that the different parts of the United Nations are making. And in that sense, we would have to look exactly at why the Secretary General is making that particular calculation. Some would argue that maybe it is a fig leaf for Russia or the Syrian government at that point to say, we're not going to try and undertake this bold action because we don't want to upset the cart. Others would say that's a political reality that he's contending with. It's not his right to determine whether or not the aid branches of the United Nations can pass into Syria without authorization, and he risks other enterprises in other parts of the world when he does so.
And you see, I take the point, but this is deeply distressing. I mean, I come from Syria originally, and I've worked in northern Syria. And even more recently, a year ago, I was in South Darfur, when the arguments that were reaching us on the ground is that the UN isn't sending food to Darfur because the legal department said that they need a Khartoum approval for sending the food.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have a couple of questions. First, we're saying on the one hand, it is what member states will allow. And here I'd argue what some member states will allow, because I doubt like Capo Verde or Paraguay have as much voice as the US or Russia.
Absolutely.
But also, who sits there and what do they talk about? During COVID, WHO spoke much more forcefully than they usually do about what Tedros, the Director General of WHO, called vaccine apartheid. That was unthinkable to me, at least, knowing the WHO. And during the whole, Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Guterres barely uttered anything of value above the noise. And here my question is, should he have? And if not, then is he just like the lowest common denominator? Would it have been different if, and here I'm testing my history, if Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General here, or Javier Perez de Cuellar, who, if the story is right, went and landed in Baghdad airport to talk to Saddam during the Kuwait invasion.
Yeah.
People seem to have like that passivity or perceived passivity, because I don't know what he's negotiating. And that's the other question. Would it be different if we had a different Secretary General, you believe?
I agree that it's deeply distressing. But the reason I want to be clear about what we are talking about when we talk about the UN is that we have to know which part of the UN we are talking about in order to diagnose the pressure points and the pain points and the sources of failure. The UN, writ broadly, is not ever just doing one thing. And so we want to disaggregate and look across different arenas, personnel, and states to figure out who exactly is producing the pain point that we see in the world, right? The real disaster that is not being addressed or solved or adequately spoken about or adequately offered assistance, right? Why is that the case? At what point in the process does that happen? Where are the different sort of sources of failure? And if we're thinking about the Secretary General, right, if you're asking, right, would it have been different if Dag Hammarskjöld were in charge, or would it have been different if Javier Perez de Cuellar would be in charge? Certainly, right? Very different kinds of styles of leadership and of diplomacy. And I think, a common critique of Antonio Guterres is that he is personally reluctant to expend political capital on high stakes conflict resolution. And he has put his political capital, he has taken the political capital he believes he has and put them squarely on climate change and public health. And therefore, he hasn't engaged in the kinds of high stakes political diplomacy that we would have seen, a Kofi Annan or a Dag Hammarskjöld do, or we would have seen a Javier Perez de Cuellar do quietly behind the scenes. And that is a clear personality difference. At the rare points where we have seen him undertake that, for instance, becoming personally involved in the Black Sea grain deal, going to Bucha, touring on the ground in Ukraine, those are points at which he has actually let other entities take the lead first in sort of trying to forge a deal. And at the point it becomes clear to him it's going to work, then he invests the Secretariat in the process. So the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue was critical in forging the initial parts of that deal. And later the Secretariat entered. And so that kind of partnership, I think, shows us that that's not his forte. That's not the place where he believes he can spend his political capital. And so, yeah, I do think in a different world with a different Secretary General, we would be seeing different kinds of high stakes political diplomacy. We might also be seeing a different shape of the UN in other ways because that's the nature of the job. It's a fluid, open one.
I would just add one point to that. And, whereas it is true that you don't routinely hear statements from Guterres that would deliberately ruffle the feathers of key member states. I mean, he does occasionally do that. Let's give him some credit. He does, occasionally speak out in ways that are very much against the, say, parochial interests of member states, like calling Russia's invasion of Ukraine illegal and immoral, like right at the outset.
The use of force by one country against another is the repudiation of the principles that every country has committed to uphold. And this applies to the present military offensives. It is wrong, it is against the Charter, it is unacceptable, but it is not irreversible. I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia.
I mean, that was, him going against the interests of a key member state, directly and deliberately and at the right time. So let's give him some credit. But at the same time, you're right. As Anjali said, he does not deeply involve himself personally in that kind of high stakes diplomacy. But you do see other parts of the UN routinely speak out and involve themselves, right? Like you see Cindy McCain, day after day, issue really, tough statements on Israel and Gaza and on, to a certain extent as well, on Sudan. You saw the former OCHA chief, Martin Griffiths, do the kind of diplomacy required to try to create a humanitarian corridor to let people out of that besieged steel plant early in the Ukraine war. So you do see other parts of the UN system doing and speaking out in really profound and direct ways.
That's interesting because 2 points. I think there has been a speaking out against, and I mean, one could argue that Guterres' position on Russia as illegal and immoral invasion, and then on Gaza, he just said it didn't come out of, vacuum and got beaten down and hasn't said much in public since, barring, repeating that it's intolerable and distressing and he is deeply concerned. But I want to go back to Anjali's point. This is a fluid position, it's done differently and is done differently according to the person. And I want to talk as a citizen. This is sort of half acceptable of an argument if we had an elected president. I mean, you could say it's people's fault they elected him. Here we're talking about a bureaucrat who's unelected, who is effectively spending massive amount of taxpayer money. And there's no way for us, the people, to actually know how the money is spent, what decisions are made, and there's no means of accountability except by states who have their own interest that we might or might, but we don't get to have a say. And I understand that the Charter of the UN is a contract between states, not peoples. But is that still a viable thing? Because the UN is not only doing well or not doing harm, it's also occupying pretty much the whole space that exists for multilateralism. The existence of it and its ability to reform implies whether others can exist or other forms can exist. Do you have any concern about this almost archaic form of global governance?
Well, when I say the office is comparatively open, I mean the charter leaves it comparatively undefined. The office is not a particularly defined office under the terms of the UN Charter. And that means that the different occupants of the office, a lot depends on their personal characteristics, their personal interests, and the particular area where they want to devote their political capital. And I do think it's worth noting the position is not elected, but it is selected. It is selected in two separate rounds. First, on the advice of the Security Council, and then by election by the General Assembly. And in theory, if we subscribe to theories of representative government, right, at its function, at its base, this is a liberal institution, then in that way, while it is not a direct selection by people, It is a selection by the representatives of people at the United Nations. Now, I take your point, though, right? The idea that we have global government without global governance is the common refrain that we see around, like, the European Union, for instance. In that sphere, the idea that there are bureaucrats who are managing vast budgets without a lot of input from people is clearly a critique that you can and should offer to any organization that seems to be not transparent and be running heavily on bureaucracies. The UN is a pretty messy organization. And when I say it's a pretty messy organization, I mean that there is a lot more transparency at different points in the process than there are in other bureaucracies because of the role that states have to play in public negotiating things like the budget, right? Now, where there is the greatest sort of possibility for corruption is in how that budget is spent once it is allocated. And so making sure that there are transparent processes for agencies to go under review and that there are meaningful ways for corruption to be held accountable is absolutely critical. And one key argument here is that the UN often sets itself up as both auditor and object. And actually, what it really should be doing is when there are problems, when there are transgressions, there should be external auditing, right? It shouldn't be the case. Like in the situation, for instance, of sexual abuse and exploitation by peacekeepers. It is clearly a problem that the UN collects these reports, investigates them themselves, and then turns it over to national capitals to provide the sort of necessary punishment if the national capital chooses to dole one out. That's a place where we see the sort of overlap of a lack of transparency internally with a lack of accountability externally coming to a head. In an ideal world, in a better, more transparent world, and one in which the UN were more responsive to people than to states, we would have an external audit. We would have an external investigation. The UN wouldn't be collecting these reports, investigating them, and then turning over them to national capitals. That is not a victim-forward way of moving through this process. It's also not a people-forward way. And I think we see this really clearly in the popular backlash in places like Haiti and the Democratic Republic of the Congo to UN peacekeeping. And so in that sense, there are these clear points where there should be more transparency. I would argue that those are at the operational level as opposed to at the top line budgetary level. Not that that isn't important.
But if we don't talk about the budget, if we talk about the treaties and the application of treaties and the behind the closed doors horse trading that happens in the UN at every level. If you still like to torture yourself by following Twitter, you'll see everybody's become an expert in international humanitarian law, and everything gets interpreted in absurd ways sometimes. And particularly if we're looking, for example, at something like the conventions that govern war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we're looking at Gaza today. The Genocide Convention is being interpreted boldly, dishonestly by almost every party that is there. I'm less concerned with the spending of the money, particularly maybe because I've seen how much money gets wasted in humanitarian operations anyway, even if you try your best. But of the very basis of defining the action, the treaties, the customary law, the international law, all of it suddenly starts to seem too fluffy, too indeterminate, and too useless when we are confronted with an active, ongoing genocide. Today, there was yet another article by yet another expert, the head of the Genocide Scholars Association, an Australian professor, who wrote, "This is undoubtedly a genocide." I mean, we're going to figure that in 5 or 10 years when the ICJ decides that it is, and then everybody who should be accountable now will have retired and spending their, nice UN or government pensions. My concern with accountability is more in life and death situations and preventing the actual consequences of crisis today. I mean, Mark, in several episodes, you've talked about the Commission on the Status of Women, for example. And the US, as the leaders of the free world, sorry, I have to laugh, they tried to block the reference to gender equality in a conference dedicated to gender equality. And this is one of the many episodes. I mean, I come from a health background. I once found a document, which is a guidance from the US government to their negotiating team on how to block any mention of the right to health in international treaties. I mean, I'm deeply suspicious of the dressing of liberalism, but as Anjali said, the UN is its members, and its members now, from the US to the European Union to others, are becoming less and less liberal and more belligerent. The US cut 60 billion in international aid, and not all of it is aid. A lot of it is weapons and economic aid. And the military budget is over $1 trillion, and ICE is going to have 120 billion in the new budget. Germany never had deficits since the Second World War, and constitutionally, they are reversing that, and they will put €500 billion in deficit to buy weapons. I mean, maybe the Red Army is at the gates. We're not just seeing it, but there's a definitive move away from solidarity and the liberal argument of we're all in this together into let's build bunkers and buy weapons. Is that going to degrade the UN even further?
Yeah, I think it will. And we are in the midst of this democratic backsliding here in the United States. And at the outset, I sort of defined what I thought as what liberalism meant, that idea that we're all in it together and that by contributing to this common cause, we can nudge the world in a better direction, reduce suffering, make the world a more interconnected, a more peaceful and prosperous place. And doing so requires a degree of enlightened self-interest that has been tossed out the door during this administration. I mean, I think it's an inevitable consequence that, the most powerful country in the world, the host of the United Nations, is now retreating from a lot of its historic international obligations and responsibilities, while at the same time undermining the trappings of democracy here at home. It's inevitable, I think, that will be reflected and reflect on the functions of the United Nations. The UN will become, and already is becoming, a less quote-unquote liberal place, because you have the United States, as you noted in the example, objecting to references of gender equality in a conference dedicated to gender equality. You also see the United States objecting to references to the Sustainable Development Goals, this kind of blueprint for pretty much everything the United Nations does is now being routinely objected to by the United States. So of course that will have consequences on the broader functioning of the UN. And the consequences will be that the UN is potentially less aspirational than it once was.
So if liberal states are getting less liberal and hence affecting liberalism or the aspirational capacity of the UN or its ability to function, there's another side to the coin. The UK is giving less aid, becoming less involved in international affairs, and this has been happening for years. So is France, so is Germany. They're not as, at least verbally, committed to the principles of this international solidarity. On the other hand, there's a set of countries like Hungary, Italy, and to an extent the United States and others that were part of this liberal order, quite integral part, that have become not only less committed to it, but openly opposed to it. If we talk about the UN as an institution that intends to do well within its mandate, what is it doing and what is it failing to do or unable to do in the midst of a democratic backsliding globally, as you called it, Mark? What should we expect from the UN?
There's this buzzword around the UN about doing less with less. So just on a very practical level, all these funding cuts mean that the US will be less involved around the world, that peacekeeping operations will not be able to fly helicopters at night, or that there will be less aid reaching people who need it, or meetings will have to be shorter because they can't pay translators to stay after hours. So on a very practical level, we should expect less from the UN going forward. I mean, big picture, I think the fundamental challenge that we, and by we, I mean, citizens of the world, will face in the coming years if this trend continues is that a lot of the progress that we've seen over the years on development in particular and on health in particular, I know those of us steeped in global health and development often look at what's gone wrong. But if you look at it big picture, since I started my career, again, like 20 years ago until today, there has been progress against nearly every single indicator on global health and development that you could measure. Sometimes the progress was slow. It was often uneven, but it was progress nonetheless. Now I fear we're entering into an era in which a lot of that progress will be either stalled or reversed. And we haven't lived in a world in which there isn't slow and steady progress against ending extreme poverty, reducing HIV, AIDS, against all of these indicators. And sort of what does that mean for the functioning of an international system at a governmental level, but also just for individuals who live in this world to know that we are entering a period, an era in which that slow and steady progress can't be guaranteed?
You see, I think our vantage points are aligned but slightly different. Because yes, globally, the numbers show steady, slow progress on most indicators. And it's true in absolute terms, but also inequality in that progress is quite significant. But as someone who has worked in conflicts and emergencies, I'd say I've been in more places than I care to count where everything got worse. I mean, my country, Syria, is one of them. But if you look at most African countries that have suffered through conflicts in the past 20 years, people have experienced certain deterioration in mortalities, morbidities, and some of them are augmented by others. Measles mortality has reduced massively for a long while child mortality of infections fluctuated, malaria changed. But my fear is that we think of what we, as the people who live in places that haven't seen that, will struggle with. Like it's almost everybody's world has ended or got screwed for a long time. It's now coming to touch us. And that is the climate crisis. That is the governments that being elected. Or Ukraine has shown Europe that, Europe is never out of conflict forever. I mean, after COVID, because it hit rich countries, everybody was motivated to sit and hash out a treaty on pandemics. Do you think that sense of impending crisis that will actually injure the rich, not only the poor, is that going to make things better? Or are people going to retract on themselves and just say, me and the deluge?
I mean, yes, we did get a pandemic treaty when disease touched the North as well as the South, but the US wasn't involved. And I think it's instructive to think about whether or not governments care that their citizens die. Because we have good evidence that some governments do not. The US government does not care if Americans die. It is a murder regime in that way. It is an actively pro-death government. So we shouldn't be surprised when that casts out to the global scale also. Now, I think this goes back to your point about what we should expect the alternative to a liberal caste multilateral system to be. In a world of retreat from the kinds of multilateral institutions that we have now, we have a couple of different options. One is the option of isolation or withdrawal. And that's, for example, what we see in the UK or the German case, pulling away from funding these organizations. That's the condition of, in some ways, benign neglect. I don't mean that to say it's a good outcome. I mean that to say that the goal is not to explicitly turn the system into one that is actively illiberal. When we look at the United States, the stated purpose of the foreign policy of the United States is to build an illiberal system. It is not just retreat. And that's the other alternative. It's not a decaying multilateralism that is primarily upheld by multilaterally minded small and medium income states, right? Who are the true engines of multilateralism. Good multilateralist states in the world are poor states that know they can only survive with global cooperation, and medium income states that find that their stake in the world is greatly enhanced by it. Powerful states often think they can get what they want. Wealthy states often think they can get what they want without multilateral arrangements. And so in that sense, the real fear is actually what we will see as these powerful states decide what they want is an illiberal international order, one in which we see the resurgence of straight empire, straight conquest, state sort of lack of understanding or a lack of belief or a lack of care that self-determination or sovereign equality underpin the system. And also critically, right, we were talking about international humanitarian law earlier, a full-scale pushing back from the idea that the legitimate functioning of war is not carried out on the backs of civilians, or that there are not laws to war, that there are not boundaries on what we can expect states to do. In this sort of formulation, there's the idea that it is simply power politics, that there are no limits on state behavior, that only military power guarantees outcomes, and that the wealthy of the world should be able to determine what happens next. And I think that that is something we see replicated down through domestic politics also. We should not expect governments that do not care if their citizens are going to die to uphold a system in which they are tasked with understanding every life as having equal value. They don't believe the lives of the people who elected them have any value. I think when we think about what the likely outcome here is, the isolationist outcome is actually a more constructive one because it means other states can step to the fore than the sort of explicitly illiberal or fascist one.
That makes a lot of sense. It is also tough to swallow that the only options we have are bad and worse.
Yeah, it's a real shit show.
I take bad over worse.
I mean, I take bad over worse, but are we really in a world where the only options are bad or worse? And agreeing that invariably we can, us who have this platform or in our privilege, have the option to take the bad. A lot of people are taking the worse with no choice. I fear that now, with the panic that is happening about budgets and about money, everybody is trying to patch the gap of money, whether by going to private sector or by cutting. Very little I hear is about the structure and function in itself. So you've done this for a long time, and you've worked on it in global dispatches and Save Us from Hell. If you had a magic wand, I was going to say if you were in Guterres' chair, but I don't think that would help. If you had a magic wand, if you had a day to do what you want, what would be your priority to change things? What would you prioritize as people who know the system well? And what would make a difference if we wanted to be optimistic?
Yeah, I would actually come back to the money question. I mean, even before these cuts by the Trump administration, you had over the last decade plus on the humanitarian space, I know this is a humanitarian focused show, that ever growing gap between needs and funding available to meet those needs. And if I had to wave my magic wand, would get rid of the whole voluntary contribution system and make everything an assessed dues contribution system whereby every state is obligated to pay into some humanitarian fund that would support people in crisis, whether that's man-made crisis, whether that's natural disaster, just have that kind of standing, robust pool of monies so that these humanitarian agencies don't need to go hat in hand every time a crisis strikes. Obviously, that's not the world we're living in, but you didn't ask me to respond to the world in which it is, but the world in which I wish it would be. So that's my answer.
Anjali, you have something to add to that?
I mean, I would say you started out by saying that you were a pessimist, and I know I gave you a very deeply pessimistic vision at the end, but I actually don't think that we are only stuck between bad and worse. because this is a period of contestation. A period of contestation is a dangerous one, certainly, but it is not one in which the inevitable outcome is going to be worse than the situation that we're in now. Now, the problem with talking like this is that people along the way will be deeply hurt, die. Not all of us will make it out the other side. You talked about 14 million excess deaths from the failure of the US to sustain its aid, right? From the shutting down of programs like PEPFAR. That's, in any case, a bad situation. But I do think it's important for us to see that there are people at every level of these systems who are motivated by the desire for human flourishing. These are not easy jobs, as you know far better than I do. There are easier ways to make a living. There are easier ways to spend your time than in the cause of supporting other people. But if we take a look at something like the climate sphere or even the public health sphere, there is side by side with every kind of innovation a set of political projects that tries to push that innovation forward. That is a place for constructive creation. And that's a place for, I think, hope, which is ultimately a discipline, right? It's the project of weighing the future as importantly as you do the present. And in that sense, I think there's a lot of space for hope because there are a lot of people who are weighing the future as importantly as they do the present. They are not by any means the loudest, most powerful people in the room. And that's a tragedy, but they're there. We see them all the time. You see them all the time in your work. People who are doing like community protection in Sudan. That is a project of hope. That is a community, a project of investment. And I think it is important for us outside of that to point to the failure of the international system that produces it. But if we're thinking about where hope lives, it lives in people who get up and stand up for their neighbors, even though it's not easy.
You have managed in 2 answers to drive me nearly to despair and to restore my spirit.
Yeah.
I think there is a conversation to be had about those who have that political project. Where is their place and what can they do, not only to survive, but potentially to exchange, to build bridges, to be able to be a counterweight? Because I take your point about the illiberal international order being a scarier situation that we are in today. But there has to be a conversation beyond all of us. That is, what is it that the citizens can do to make that liberal order that we live in less prone to being just not the worst option there is?
Yeah.
Since we look at impact and we're talking to a wide range of audience, what could people do? What would you say? Me, you, people who are practitioners of humanitarianism or receivers of it, what is the action that one can do to make things better?
I'll answer this question in the context of me being an American living in the middle of the country. One of the real disappointments that I saw when USAID was dismantled was how the dismantling of USAID became a partisan affair. USAID for a long time had broad bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats alike supported its existence and many of its projects around the world. And generally, the idea of foreign aid, sure, they would emphasize different things, but broadly speaking, the idea of doing foreign aid was never a highly contentious or partisan project. But then when USAID was dismantled, you only saw Democrats speaking up. Republicans, who you would expect to have defended USAID, did not, at least publicly. So I would want, American citizens to speak up themselves. There is not like a broad political constituency here in the United States for USAID or foreign aid, but why not build one? Why not speak up?
Thank you, Mark. Anjali?
So speaking as an educator in this environment, we are living through a period of epistemological collapse. The idea that the way we know things and what we believe to be the truth is folding in on itself across multiple different kinds of systems, multiple different kinds of populations, multiple different kinds of people. Part of the reason that we are in the situation that we're in, that Mark was just outlining, is that we are living through a period of time where our shared understanding of the truth is fading away. And in that context, I think one thing everybody can do is stand up for what they know to be the truth and what they know to be decent. And that seems like a very small thing, but it's not when there are all of these forces that make it easier to agree with falsehood or agree with mendacity. And that, I think, is particularly instructive at the community level. It's particularly instructive for people to do in their environments, in their workplace. When we think about moving through a period of resurgent authoritarianism or resurgent fascism, we know from lots of studies of previous collapses like this that what really matters is what people do at the individual level, the extent to which they stand up and say, I have values and they're not these. And so that's not necessarily easy, but it is within every individual person's power. The famous Polish story about the collapse of authoritarianism begins with the idea that one day the greengrocer wakes up and says, today I don't lie because the regime wants me to. That sounds sort of dramatic for the period that we're living through, but it is the kind of time we're living through.
It is.
Where we're told we shouldn't care that our political decisions might kill 14 million people because they're somewhere else. And building a constituency for that begins with saying, actually, I do care. And I think some of my neighbors care too.
Anjali, Mark, thank you very, very much. This was a very interesting conversation. And I really hope we get to continue it again.
This was great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. Our show is produced, edited, and mixed by Levi Sharp. Editorial oversight provided by Erwin Loy, Eric Reddy, and Freddie Buswell. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Please rate and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider becoming a member of The New Humanitarian to help us continue reporting from the heart of crises. Go to www.thenewhumanitarian.org to find out more.